The desert always looked calm from a distance, which was its favorite lie. Up close, it was a restless, shifting thing that hummed quietly beneath the surface, as if the sand itself remembered storms that had not yet happened. Rafe had lived beside it long enough to recognize the signs. The wind was wrong that morning, too still, too careful, and the horizon shimmered not with heat, but with something sharper, like a reflection that didn't belong. He stood outside his shelter with a dented cup in hand, staring at the line where sky met sand, and sighed as if the desert had personally inconvenienced him. "All right," he muttered. "What did you break this time?" The desert, as usual, refused to answer. He took a sip of water that tasted faintly like metal and regret, then noticed it. A scar in the sand, jagged and unnatural, cutting across the dunes as if something enormous had dragged itself unwillingly across the surface. Rafe narrowed his eyes. He had a strict personal policy about strange things in the desert, which was to avoid them entirely. This policy had kept him alive, moderately comfortable, and only occasionally bored. He stared at the scar for a long moment, then sighed again. Longer this time. "This is how people die," he informed no one. "They see something strange and think, I should definitely go toward that." He set the cup down, grabbed a tool that could generously be described as a multi-purpose wrench, and less generously as a piece of metal he refused to throw away, and started walking. The closer he got, the less it looked like debris, and the more it looked like a story he did not want to be part of. The metal was not from any ship he recognized. Too smooth in some places, too fractured in others, like it had tried to hold a shape and then changed its mind halfway through. Faint light flickered beneath the wreckage, pulsing weakly, like a heartbeat that wasn't entirely committed to continuing. Rafe crouched beside a half-buried section of hull and tapped it with his wrench. It hummed back, which he found deeply unhelpful. "Fantastic," he said. "It hums. That's always a good sign. Things that hum are either very expensive or about to explode." He shifted around the wreckage, scanning for anything that looked like it might explode first, and that was when he saw her. At first, she looked like another piece of debris, pale against the sand, motionless, partially buried beneath a collapsed panel. Then she moved, just a fraction, a small, stubborn shift that was more defiance than survival. Rafe froze. "No," he said immediately. "No, absolutely not. That is a person. I do not handle people. That is outside my skill set." She turned her head slightly, enough for him to see her face. Human almost. Too composed for someone in that position, even half-conscious. And then there were the ears. Long, elegant, angled in a way that caught the light differently, marking her as something that did not belong to this desert or perhaps to this world at all. Her eyes opened, sharp and focused despite everything, and fixed on him. There was no plea in them, no fear, just a clear, unwavering assessment, as if she were trying to determine whether he was a problem that needed solving. Rafe pointed at her with the wrench. "I would like to state, for the record, that I was not involved in whatever this is." She said nothing. If anything, her expression suggested that his statement had not been particularly useful. He hesitated, then gestured vaguely at the wreckage pinning her. "You, seem to be under something." Still nothing. "Right," he said. "Silent type. That's fine. I can work with that. I also prefer not talking while being crushed." He stepped closer, testing the stability of the metal. It shifted slightly, sand cascading down in thin streams. The structure was unstable, but not immediately catastrophic, which in his experience meant it would become catastrophic the moment he touched it. He glanced at her again. She was watching him with the same steady intensity, as if daring him to make a mistake. "Well," he muttered, "if this goes wrong, I'm blaming you." He wedged the wrench under the edge of the panel and pushed. The metal resisted, then gave just enough to make him think he might actually succeed. He adjusted his grip, leaned his weight into it, and felt the panel lift a fraction higher. "That's right," he said through clenched teeth. "Defy gravity. That always ends well." The panel shifted again, enough for her to pull one arm free. She didn't hesitate. With a sudden, precise movement, She pushed against the wreckage, adding just enough force to tip the balance. The panel slid aside with a grinding sound, collapsing into the sand. Rafe stumbled back, catching his balance with an undignified flail of arms. "And there it is," he said. "The part where it all collapses and, oh, it didn't collapse. That's new." She tried to sit up and failed. The effort alone seemed to cost her more than she was willing to admit. For a moment she remained still, breathing shallowly, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. Rafe watched her, then looked back at the wreckage, as if hoping it might offer an alternative solution. It did not. He sighed, already regretting everything. "All right," he said. "Here's the situation. You're injured, I'm apparently involved, and neither of us is happy about it." He crouched beside her, careful, deliberate. "I'm going to move you. If you object, now would be a great time to say something." She didn't. "Good," he said. "I'm choosing to interpret that as consent and not ominous silence." He slipped an arm under her shoulders, lifting her as gently as he could. She was lighter than he expected, but there was a tension in her body, a readiness, as if, even injured, she was prepared to resist if necessary. As he carried her away from the wreckage, he glanced down at her and said, "Just so we're clear, if you turn out to be important, I'm going to be very annoyed." Her eyes flicked toward him, and for the briefest moment, there was something there, something almost like amusement, quickly buried beneath exhaustion. Rafe shook his head. "Great," he muttered. "I rescued a mysterious, silent, probably dangerous stranger from a crashed alien ship in the middle of nowhere." He adjusted his grip and started back toward his shelter. "This is exactly how my week was supposed to go." By the time Rafe reached the shelter, the sun had already climbed high enough to make every step feel like a negotiation with gravity. The desert did not like to be interrupted, and it expressed this through heat. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside, carrying her across the threshold as if that somehow made the situation more official. "Welcome," he said, a little out of breath, "to the finest collection of spare parts and questionable decisions this side of nowhere." The shelter did not respond. It rarely did. He lowered her carefully onto the narrow cot, which creaked in immediate protest. "That's normal," he added quickly. "It complains about everyone." She lay still for a moment, eyes half open, taking in the interior with a sharp, methodical awareness that did not match her condition. Rafe noticed the way her gaze moved, counting, measuring, mapping, tools on the wall, water containers, the patched seams in the metal structure. Even injured, she was cataloging everything. "Just so you know," he said, grabbing a cloth and a small container of antiseptic, "there's nothing worth stealing here, unless you're very passionate about rust." He knelt beside her and hesitated, examining the damage more closely now that he had proper light. The wounds were real. Deep cuts, burns along one side, bruising that suggested impact far beyond what a normal body should tolerate. And yet, they weren't worsening. If anything, they looked contained. "That's not how that works," he muttered. Her eyes shifted to him. "I mean," he clarified, "usually people in your situation are significantly more dying." She said nothing, which he was beginning to suspect was her preferred method of communication. Rafe dipped the cloth into the antiseptic and held it up. "This is going to sting," he said. "On the bright side, if you pass out, I won't take it personally." He pressed the cloth gently against one of the cuts. She did not flinch. He paused. "That's either impressive or concerning." He tried again, applying more pressure this time, cleaning the wound with careful movements. Still nothing. No sharp intake of breath, no tightening of muscles, no sign of discomfort beyond a faint narrowing of her eyes. "Right," he said slowly. "You're either very tough or your pain receptors are on vacation." Her gaze held his, steady and unreadable. Rafe leaned back slightly, considering. "Or," he added, "you're trying not to show it, which I respect. Terrible strategy, but very committed." He moved to the next wound, working methodically. The shelter filled with the quiet sounds of cloth against skin, the faint hiss of antiseptic reacting, and the occasional creak of metal as the structure adjusted to the heat. After a while, he realized she was watching his hands, not his face. "Don't worry," he said. "I have absolutely no formal training. This is all instinct and poor decision-making. A pause. Mostly poor decision-making. Her eyes shifted, just slightly, as if reassessing that statement. He finished cleaning the worst of the injuries and reached for a strip of fabric to bind them. As he worked, he noticed something else. Something subtle but impossible to ignore. The edges of the wounds were changing. Not closing, not exactly, but stabilizing in a way that felt too fast, too deliberate. He frowned. You heal like this all the time? No answer. Of course you don't, he said. That would be too convenient. He tied off the last bandage and sat back, wiping his hands on his shirt. There. You are now slightly less injured than before. I expect a full recovery by tomorrow because at this point, that wouldn't even surprise me. She shifted, slowly pushing herself up into a seated position. The movement was controlled, precise, as if she were testing the limits of her body rather than struggling against them. Rafe blinked. Or you could just do that. That works too. For a moment, they sat in silence. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the shelter in long, whispering strokes. She looked at him again, more directly this time. He pointed at himself. Rafe, that's my name. You can use it if you decide to start talking. She held his gaze. Or not, he added. We can keep this mysterious. Builds character. He stood and moved to a small storage unit, pulling out a metal cup and filling it with water. He hesitated, then glanced back at her. You do drink water, right? I feel like that's a safe assumption. But given everything else, I'm open to being wrong. He walked back and handed her the cup. She accepted it without hesitation, her fingers brushing against his briefly. The contact was cool, not cold, but different, like touching something that carried its own internal temperature, separate from the heat of the room. She drank slowly, measured, never taking her eyes off him. Rafe shifted under the scrutiny. If you're trying to figure out if I'm a threat, he said, I assure you, I am not. I have a strict policy against threatening people who could probably outfight me while injured. A faint pause. Which I am increasingly confident you could. She lowered the cup, considering him. Then finally she spoke. Why? The word was quiet, but it carried weight, as if it had been chosen carefully. Rafe blinked. Why? What? Help. He stared at her for a moment, then leaned back slightly, thinking. That's a good question, he admitted. I had a whole speech prepared about moral obligation and basic decency, but honestly, I think it's mostly because leaving you there felt worse than not leaving you there. He shrugged. Also, I was curious, which is historically a terrible reason to do anything. She studied him, her expression unreadable. He gestured vaguely. Your turn. Why were you out there, buried under a very expensive-looking mistake? She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away. Not yet, she said. Rafe exhaled, nodding. Fair enough. I asked, you declined. We maintained the balance. He moved to the other side of the room, giving her space. You can rest, or not. You seem like the type who doesn't rest unless forced. He glanced back at her. Try not to die. It would make this whole situation very awkward. For a brief moment, something shifted in her expression again. Subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable. Not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest it existed. The night settled slowly, like the desert was deciding whether it trusted the darkness enough to let it stay. The heat withdrew in layers, leaving behind a cool stillness that made every small sound seem intentional. Rafe sat near the entrance of the shelter, leaning back in a chair that had long ago surrendered any claim to comfort. It gave a soft, complaining creak every time he shifted, which was often. I don't know why I keep fixing you, he muttered to the chair. You never improve. Behind him, she was awake. He could tell without looking. There was a difference in the air when someone like her was alert, something precise, attentive, like a blade resting on a surface without quite touching it. You're not sleeping, he said. A pause. No, she answered. He nodded, as if he had expected that. Good. That would have been suspicious. People who recover that fast and then immediately fall asleep are usually hiding something. Or plotting. Another pause. I am not plotting. Yet, he said. It's still early. He stood, stretching slightly, and grabbed a small device from the workbench, a flickering projector with a cracked casing. He tapped it twice before it responded, casting a faint holographic display into the air. Lines of data scrolled unevenly, some sections distorted. She watched it closely. "Don't get too excited," Rafe said. "It's mostly broken. I use it to pretend I understand things." He adjusted the projection, bringing up a rough map of the surrounding desert. Several points blinked faintly, old markers, some no longer accurate. Her eyes followed the shifting lights. "You track this place," she said. "I try," he replied. "The desert doesn't appreciate being tracked, but I like to feel included." She leaned forward slightly, studying the projection with more focus than her condition should allow. Rafe noticed. "You recognize something?" A brief hesitation. "No." He squinted at her. That sounded like a yes disguised as a no. "I'm familiar with that technique. I use it when people ask if I've done something irresponsible." She didn't respond, but her attention lingered on one section of the map longer than the others. Rafe followed her gaze. "That area?" he asked. "Nothing out there but shifting dunes and the occasional bad decision." Silence. He crossed his arms. "You're doing it again. The mysterious silence. It's very effective, but also deeply unhelpful." She glanced at him, then back at the projection. "You repair everything yourself." It wasn't a question. Rafe looked around his shelter, at the patched walls, the mismatched equipment, the careful balance of function and improvisation. "Everything that breaks," he said, "which is everything." "Why not leave?" He smiled faintly. "Ah, that's the other question people like to ask." He reached over and tapped the projector again, stabilizing the flicker. "Leaving requires resources, fuel, a ship that doesn't look like it might fall apart if you look at it too hard. Also, destinations." He gestured vaguely toward the outside. "Out there, I know what to expect. It's dangerous, unpredictable, occasionally tries to kill me, but it's consistent about it." A small pause. "People," he added, "are less consistent." She considered that. The projection shifted again, briefly glitching into unreadable symbols before correcting itself. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she had caught something in that distortion. "You missed something," she said. Rafe blinked. "I miss a lot of things. You'll have to be more specific." She reached out, her hand moving with careful precision, and pointed at a section of the display. "Here." He leaned in, following her indication. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just another cluster of data points, partially degraded. Then he adjusted the filter. The distortion resolved into a faint signal, buried, irregular, easy to overlook. Rafe frowned. "That wasn't there before." "It was," she said. "You did not see it." He stared at the display, then at her. "You're telling me this broken piece of junk was hiding something, and you just noticed?" She didn't answer directly. "That's unsettling," he decided. "I was comfortable being the most observant person in this room." A flicker of something passed through her expression again, brief, almost amused. Rafe leaned closer to the projection, adjusting the settings. The signal clarified slightly, enough to suggest structure. "It's, a beacon?" he said slowly. "No, not a beacon. Something quieter. Low output. Designed not to be noticed." He glanced at her. "You're sure you've never seen this before?" She met his gaze. "No." He held the look for a second longer, then sighed. "Right, of course. Consistency is overrated." He straightened, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, whatever it is, it's not mine, which means it belongs to someone who is either very careful or very lost." He gestured at her. "Given recent events, I'm leaning toward very careful." She shifted slightly, the movement smoother now, more controlled. The signs of injury were still there, but diminished, as if her body was quietly rewriting its own limitations. Rafe noticed, of course. "You're healing faster than I can get used to," he said. "At this rate, I'm going to start taking notes." She tilted her head slightly. "You adapt quickly." "I adapt out of necessity," he replied. "If I didn't, I'd be dead. Or worse, I'd be comfortable." That earned him a longer look. He gestured toward the cot. "You should rest. Again. I know, very repetitive advice, but I'm committed to it." She didn't move. Instead, she asked, "If I had been a threat, would you have helped me?" Rafe considered that. "Depends," he said finally. "Would you have been an obvious threat or a subtle one?" She didn't answer. "Because obvious threats are easier," he continued. "You see them, you avoid them. Everyone goes home. Subtle threats, those are the ones that get you." He shrugged. "But you weren't either. You were just there, injured, annoyed about it." A pause. "I respect that." She watched him, her expression steady, but there was something else there now, something quieter, more thoughtful. Rafe glanced back at the projection, then at her. "You're going to leave, aren't you?" The question hung in the air, simple but inevitable. She didn't answer immediately. Then after a moment she said, "Yes." He nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. "Figured." He turned off the projector, the light fading until the shelter was left with only the faint glow of the outside night filtering in. "Well," he said, settling back into his chair, which creaked in familiar protest. "Try not to do it dramatically. I've had enough surprises for 1 week." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. Somewhere between the quiet and the slow rhythm of the desert night, something unspoken settled between them. Not trust, not yet, but the outline of it. Rafe closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "And if you are secretly important," he added, "I'm still going to be very annoyed." This time, the pause that followed felt different, softer, almost like agreement. Rafe woke before the light reached the horizon, which meant the desert had decided to be polite for once. For a few seconds, he stayed still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the shelter holding itself together. Then he remembered. He turned his head toward the cot. Empty. He sat up immediately, blinking once as if that might fix it. "No," he said, very calmly. "No, that's not how this works. You don't just disappear. That's extremely inconsiderate." He swung his legs off the chair and stood, scanning the room. Nothing disturbed. No sign of struggle. No sign of anything, really. Just the same patch walls, the same tools, the same chair that creaked as if it disapproved of sudden movements. Rafe stepped outside. The desert stretched endlessly, unchanged, which was suspicious in its own way. The early light painted everything in soft tones, hiding details rather than revealing them. He looked around, squinting slightly. "All right," he muttered. "If I were a mysterious, fast-healing stranger with excellent timing, where would I—" He stopped. There were footprints. Light, precise, barely visible, but there, leading away from the shelter, cutting a narrow path across the sand. Rafe followed them a few steps, then stopped again, hands on his hips. "Of course," he said. "Leaves without a word. Classic. Very dramatic. I would have at least left a note, or taken something. That's what people usually do." He looked back at the shelter, then at the footprints again. "Not that I'm complaining," he added quickly. "This is ideal. Situation resolved. No further complications. Absolutely no reason for anything unusual to happen next." He stood there for a moment longer, watching the trail fade into the distance. Then he sighed. "Just a quick look," he told himself, "to confirm she didn't collapse 5 meters away. That's responsible. That's not getting involved. That's minimal involvement." He started walking. The footprints were easy to follow at first, clear impressions in the soft sand. But the further he went, the less certain they became. The desert shifted subtly, erasing edges, softening lines. After a while, Rafe slowed, frowning. "You'd think someone with your level of everything would leave a better trail," he muttered. He took another step and stopped. The footprints ended, not faded, not scattered, ended. Rafe stared at the spot, then looked around, as if expecting the answer to be written somewhere obvious. "Well," he said, "that's not unsettling at all." He crouched, examining the sand. No drag marks, no signs of a jump or a fall, just a clean, impossible stop. He straightened slowly. "All right," he said, nodding to himself. "New rule. When footprints end abruptly in the desert, you go back." He turned and froze. Someone was standing there, not far, close enough that he should have noticed, close enough that he definitely should have heard something. She stood exactly as he had last seen her, except not injured, not weakened. Composed, still, watching him. Rafe blinked. "You know," he said carefully, "most people use doors, or at least approach from a visible direction." She tilted her head slightly. "You followed?" "You left," he replied. It seemed relevant. A pause. "I did not intend to be followed." "Then you shouldn't have left footprints," he said. "That's on you." For a moment they just looked at each other, the silence stretching out between them. Then Rafe gestured vaguely at the sand. "Also, you stopped existing for about 3 seconds back there. That was concerning." "I moved." "That's not what moving looks like," he said. "It is," she replied, "when you know how." Rafe considered that, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'm choosing not to unpack that." He glanced around as if expecting something else to appear. "So, you're leaving? Again?" "Yes." "Good," he said quickly. "That's consistent. I like consistency. It makes things easier to understand." She watched him, her expression steady. Rafe shifted his weight. "You could have said something," he added, "before leaving. Just a quick goodbye or thank you or I am definitely not important. Please forget me." A faint pause. "I said enough." He let out a short breath, almost a laugh. "Right, of course you did." The wind shifted slightly, brushing across the sand in long, quiet strokes. She took a step back. Rafe noticed immediately. "There it is," he said. "The dramatic exit." She studied him for a moment, then spoke. "Rafe." He blinked. "You remembered." "Yes. That's reassuring." Another pause, then she said, "Sorev." The name settled into the air, carrying a weight he couldn't quite place. Rafe repeated it quietly. "Sorev." He nodded once. "Good name. Very important sounding. Not that that means anything." She held his gaze. "It does not," she said. "Of course it doesn't," he agreed. "That would be too convenient." A brief silence followed. Then she turned. This time, when she walked away, there was no hesitation, no sign of injury, no trace of the person he had carried through the sand. Rafe watched her go, arms crossed loosely, his expression somewhere between thoughtful and mildly annoyed. "Next time, monsieur," he called after her, "try not to crash your ship so close to my place. It's bad for the property value." She didn't turn back. He stood there until she disappeared again, the desert swallowing her presence without a trace. Then he exhaled slowly. "Well," he said to no one, "that was definitely not normal." He turned and started back toward the shelter, the early light stretching long shadows across the sand. After a few steps he stopped, looked back once more, then shook his head and continued walking. "Not important," he muttered. "Definitely not important." The desert had a way of pretending nothing had happened. By the third morning, it was doing an excellent job of it. Rafe stood outside his shelter with his usual cup, staring at the horizon like it had personally offended him. There were no crash marks anymore, just smooth dunes, carefully rearranged by the night winds. No footprints, no strange signals on the scanner. No quiet, long-eared strangers appearing behind him without warning. "Good," he said. "Back to normal." "I like normal. Normal is predictable. Normal does not involve disappearing people." He took a sip. The ground vibrated. Rafe paused mid-sip, lowering the cup slowly. "Normal," he repeated, "is apparently negotiable." The vibration deepened, not violent, but deliberate, like something large had decided to announce its presence without being rude about it. The air shifted next, a pressure that settled across the desert, flattening the silence. Then the sky changed. Rafe looked up. For a moment he thought it was a trick of light, reflection maybe, or some atmospheric glitch. Then the shapes clarified. Massive structures descending from above, their surfaces smooth and seamless, catching the sun in controlled flashes. Not falling, not crashing, arriving. Rafe stared for a long second, then nodded once. "Of course," he said. "Why wouldn't there be several enormous ships over my house?" The ships slowed as they descended, positioning themselves with unnerving precision. No sound of engines, no visible propulsion, just controlled motion. like gravity had decided to cooperate. One of them stopped directly overhead. Rafe stepped back instinctively, glancing up at the shadow it cast. "That seems excessive," he muttered. "I am one person. I don't require this level of attention." A section of the ship shifted, no seams visible, no clear mechanism, just a smooth rearrangement of surface until an opening formed. From it, smaller crafts detached, descending rapidly but without turbulence. Rafe watched them land a short distance away, sand dispersing in controlled waves rather than chaotic bursts. "Well," he said, "this is going very well." The craft settled. A moment passed, then they opened. Figures stepped out, their movements synchronized, precise. Armor that reflected the light in subtle patterns, not decorative, not excessive, functional, refined. Weapons visible but not raised. Rafe crossed his arms, considering. "All right," he said quietly. "Option 1, run. Option 2, stay here and pretend this is someone else's problem." He looked around. There was no one else. "Excellent," he concluded. "Option 2 it is." The figures approached without haste, covering the distance with steady, controlled strides. There was no aggression in their posture, but there was something else. Certainty, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Rafe remained where he was, shifting his weight slightly as they stopped a few meters away. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of them stepped forward. "Identify yourself," the figure said. The voice was clear, modulated slightly by the armor, but unmistakably calm. Rafe blinked. "That's a strong opening," he said. "Very direct. I respect that." A pause. "I'm Rafe," he added. "I live here. I was here first, if that matters." The figure regarded him, unreadable behind the helmet. "Are you alone?" Jordan asked. Rafe glanced over his shoulder at the shelter, then back. "Emotionally or physically?" Another pause. "Physically." "Yes," he said. "Very much so. It's kind of the whole point of living out here." The figure seemed to process that. Then, without raising its voice, it asked, "Where is the Queen?" Rafe froze. Not dramatically, just enough for the moment to stretch slightly longer than it should have. Then he blinked. "I'm sorry," he said. "The what?" "The Queen," the figure repeated. "She was here." Rafe let out a slow breath, looking up at the massive ship overhead, then back at the soldiers in front of him. "Well," he said carefully, "that depends." "On what?" He gestured vaguely at them. "On whether the person you're referring to is the same person I'm thinking of." The figure didn't respond. Rafe nodded. "Right, of course." No helpful clarification. He shifted his stance, considering his words. "I did meet someone," he said. "Recently. Arrived unexpectedly. Left in a similar fashion. Did not mention being a queen, which feels like an important detail to leave out." The soldiers remained still, but something in the air changed. Attention sharpening, focus narrowing. "She was injured," Rafe continued. "I helped. She recovered. She left. End of story." "Describe her," the figure said. Rafe hesitated, then shrugged. "Looked human. Mostly. Long ears. Very calm. Spoke in short sentences like she was rationing words." He tilted his head slightly. "Also had a habit of appearing behind me without making any sound, which I found deeply concerning." A brief pause. The figure stepped closer. "That is her," it said. Rafe nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "That tracks." Silence followed, heavy but controlled. Then the figure spoke again. "You will come with us." Rafe raised an eyebrow. "Will I?" "It is not a request." He considered that, then glanced at the ships again. "I was afraid you were going to say that." Another pause. Then the figure added, "You are under her protection." Rafe blinked. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm under whose protection?" "The Queen's." He stared at them for a long moment. Then he let out a quiet breath and rubbed his face. "Of course I am," he muttered. "That makes perfect sense. I rescue one mysterious person, and now I'm apparently involved in royal matters." He looked back at them. "Just to clarify," he said, "this is not an interrogation?" "No." "Good," he replied. because I would have been very bad at that. I tend to answer questions honestly, which I understand is not ideal in those situations. The figure gestured slightly toward the craft. Rafe looked at it, then back at his shelter. Well, he said, I suppose this is where things stop being normal entirely. He started walking. After a few steps, he paused and glanced over his shoulder. If this turns out to be a misunderstanding, he added, I'm going to be extremely disappointed. No one responded. Rafe nodded to himself. Yes, he said, that's about what I expected. The inside of the craft was quieter than Rafe expected, which somehow made it worse. He stepped in, paused, then looked back out at his shelter as if it might object to him leaving. It didn't. It never did. It just sat there, slightly tilted, holding itself together out of habit. Well, he said softly, if I don't come back, you're still not getting fixed. No one responded, which felt appropriate. The entrance sealed behind him without a sound. No hiss, no mechanical shift. Just a seamless closing, as if the opening had never been there. Rafe turned slowly, taking in the interior. Smooth surfaces, no visible seams, no obvious controls. The space felt intentional. Not decorative, not sterile. Designed in a way that assumed you already understood it. I don't, he said out loud. Just for the record. One of the soldiers gestured forward. Rafe nodded. Yes, of course. Mysterious pointing. Very effective. He followed. The floor responded subtly under his steps. Not moving, not exactly, but adjusting. As if it knew where he was going before he did. He glanced down, then up again. I'm choosing to believe that's helpful, he said, and not a sign that the floor is thinking. They moved through a corridor that curved gently, the walls shifting color slightly as they passed. Not lights, not quite. More like the surface itself was reacting. Rafe reached out, then stopped just short of touching it. I have a rule, he said. If I don't understand it, I don't touch it. It's how I've survived this long. The soldier in front of him did not turn around. That and luck, Rafe added. Mostly luck. They entered a larger space. It wasn't a room in the way he expected. There were no clear boundaries, no defined corners. The space simply expanded, opening into a central area where several figures stood, their armor distinct from the others, more detailed, more precise. Rafe slowed, then stopped a few steps behind his escort. All right, he said quietly. This looks important. No one answered. He nodded to himself. Yes, definitely important. One of the figures turned toward him. The helmet design was different, more refined, less utilitarian. Authority, but not exaggerated. You are Rafe, the figure said. Rafe raised a hand slightly. That is still my name, yes. Good memory. A pause. You assisted her. I did, he said, without knowing who her was, which I feel should count for something. Another figure stepped closer. You were alone with her. Yes, Rafe replied. Very alone. Just the two of us, a collapsing ship, and my excellent decision-making skills. Silence. Rafe shifted slightly. That last part was a joke. No reaction. Right, he said. Tough room? The first figure spoke again. What did she say to you? Rafe considered that, then shrugged. Not much. She asked why I helped. I gave what I thought was a reasonable answer. She declined to explain anything in return. A pause. She revealed nothing of her status? No, he said, which again feels like an important detail to include in most conversations. The figures exchanged brief glances. Rafe watched them, then crossed his arms loosely. If it helps, he added, she did say being important is inconvenient, which I now understand is either very accurate or deeply misleading. Another pause. Then the first figure said, she instructed that you are not to be harmed. Rafe blinked. Yes, I've heard that part. I appreciate it. It's reassuring. She gave no explanation. That sounds like her, Rafe said. Very consistent. The room settled into a quiet that felt less tense and more uncertain. Rafe noticed. You don't know why either, he said. No one answered. He nodded slowly. That makes two of us then. One of the figures stepped closer. You expect something in return? Rafe tilted his head. For helping her? Yes. He considered that for a moment, then shook his head. No, he said. Not really. The figure paused. You did not know who she was. No. You had no obligation. Correct. You assisted anyway. Yes. Another pause. That is illogical. Rafe smiled faintly. That's what I keep telling people. Silence lingered, but it had changed. Less rigid, more curious. Rafe shifted his weight, glancing around the space again. Look, he said, I don't know what you're expecting here. I helped someone who needed help. She left. Now you're here. That's the whole story. He gestured lightly. If there's something else I should know, now would be a great time to mention it. The figures remained still. Then slowly the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for Rafe to feel it. A presence. He turned. She was standing at the far end of the space. Not hidden, not arriving. Just there. Sorev. No injury, no hesitation. The same composed stillness. But now it carried something else. Weight. Authority that didn't need to be displayed because it was already understood. The figures around him straightened instantly, their posture shifting with precise uniformity. Rafe looked at them, then back at her. Right, he said quietly. That explains a lot. She stepped forward, her movement measured, controlled. The space seemed to adjust around her, subtle but undeniable. Rafe watched her approach, then gestured lightly. You could have mentioned this, he said, at any point. She stopped a few steps away. You did not ask the correct questions, she replied. He nodded once. Yes, that does sound like something you would say. A brief silence, then he added. For the record, I would have asked better questions if I had known the stakes involved. Her gaze held his. You asked what mattered. Rafe paused. That's inconveniently reassuring, he said. Around them the figures remained still, waiting, but no longer directing the moment. Rafe glanced at them, then back at her. So, he said, what happens now? She considered him for a moment. Then she said, you return. He blinked. That's it? Yes. He looked around again, at the ship, the soldiers, the scale of everything that had suddenly become part of his morning. Then he exhaled slowly. All right, he said. I was expecting something more complicated. A faint pause. It is, she said. Rafe smiled slightly. Of course it is. He took a step back, then another, already turning toward the direction he had come from. After a moment he stopped, looked back at her. You're going to explain this eventually, right? He asked. She didn't answer. Rafe nodded. Right, he said. Consistent. He turned again, continuing forward. As he walked, he muttered under his breath, I should have stayed in bed. The desert felt different when Rafe stepped out of the craft, though he couldn't immediately explain why. The sand was still sand, the sky still too wide, the heat already beginning its daily argument with everything that moved. But something had shifted. He turned once as the craft behind him sealed itself again without a sound. The massive ships above held their positions for a moment longer, suspended like thoughts not yet finished. Rafe watched them, arms loosely crossed. You know, he said, if this is all a very elaborate dream, I'm going to be extremely annoyed when I wake up. The ships did not respond, which he appreciated. Consistency was important. One by one they began to rise. No noise, no visible force, just controlled ascent, as if the sky itself had decided to make room for them. Rafe tilted his head, following their movement. That's still unsettling, he muttered. You'd think something that large would at least make a sound. A polite one. The last ship lingered a fraction longer than the others. Rafe noticed. Of course, he said. There's always one that stays behind for dramatic effect. A section of its surface shifted, forming an opening. Not wide, not grand, just enough. And then she was there. Sorev stepped forward, framed briefly against the light before descending, not with force but with a controlled glide that ended in a soft contact with the sand a few meters from him. Rafe watched her approach, his expression steady, though something quieter had settled behind it. "You're improving your timing," he said. "This is much less alarming than appearing behind me." She stopped in front of him, her posture unchanged, her presence as composed as ever. "You are unharmed," she said. He nodded. "So far. The day is still young." A brief pause. He glanced upward. "Your fleet seems satisfied." "They are," she replied. Rafe shifted his weight, looking at her more closely now, not as a question, but as an understanding that had taken its time arriving. "You didn't tell them everything," he said. "No." "They don't know why you protected me." "No." He exhaled slowly, nodding. "Good. I was worried I'd have to explain myself, and I'm not very good at that." A faint flicker of something passed through her expression, small but no longer unfamiliar. Rafe gestured vaguely between them. "So," he said, "this is the part where you finally explain, or we both pretend it doesn't need explaining?" She held his gaze. Then she said, "You did not treat me as I am." He considered that. "I treated you as someone stuck under a piece of very inconvenient metal." "Yes." That seemed appropriate at the time. Another pause. "It was," she said. Rafe let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "You know, I was expecting something more complicated. Political implications, strategic advantage, hidden motives. There were none." He nodded slowly. "That's new." The wind shifted again, moving around them rather than through them, as if giving the moment space. Rafe looked back toward his shelter, then at the empty horizon where the ships had been. "Everything out here makes sense," he said. "In its own way. The desert tries to kill you, but it does it honestly. No surprises, no hidden meanings." He glanced at her. "You don't." She didn't respond immediately. "I was not meant to be there," she said. "I gathered that," he replied. "I was not meant to be seen as I was." He nodded. "Also gathered." A brief silence settled. Then she added, "You did not change your behavior when you could have." Rafe frowned slightly. "I didn't know I could have." "You would have," she said. "Eventually." He thought about that, longer this time. "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe I would have just asked more questions and gotten the same answers." A faint pause. "That is likely." He smiled slightly. "Good. I prefer that version." They stood there for a moment, the quiet stretching out, but no longer uncertain. Rafe shifted his stance, glancing down at the sand, then back up. "So what happens now?" he asked. "You continue," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Continue what?" She gestured subtly toward the shelter. "This." Rafe followed the motion, then looked back at her. "That's it?" "Yes." He let out a slow breath, nodding. "All right, I can do that. I'm very good at continuing." Another pause, then he added, "Are you going to crash another ship nearby, or should I expect a quieter visit next time?" "I will not crash," she said. "Good," he replied. "It's bad for the sand." Something in her expression shifted again, still restrained, still controlled, but undeniably there. Rafe noticed. "You're doing that thing again," he said. "What thing?" "The almost smile," he replied. "It's very subtle. You might want to work on it." "I am not smiling." "Of course not," he said. "That would be inappropriate." The wind picked up slightly, brushing past them. She stepped back. Rafe watched her, recognizing the motion now, the quiet signal of departure. "Right," he said. "This part again." She met his gaze one last time. "You will not be disturbed," she said. He nodded. "I believe you." "Mostly." A brief pause. "Rafe," she said. He tilted his head. "Yes?" "You asked the correct question." He blinked. "Which one?" But she had already turned. This time when she moved, he followed her with his eyes, not expecting to understand it, but no longer needing to. She did not disappear. She simply became distant, then part of the horizon, then gone in the way things left in the desert, completely, without residue. Rafe stood there for a while, longer than he needed to. Then he exhaled and turned back toward the shelter. As he stepped inside, the chair creaked in familiar complaint. "Yes," he said, dropping into it. "I know. A lot happened." The room was the same. The walls, the tools, the quiet hum of everything holding together, but it didn't feel smaller anymore. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment before closing his eyes briefly. Then he opened them again. "All right," he said to no one. "Back to normal." A pause, he glanced toward the door, then shook his head. "Whatever that means now."